Hey everyone, this is Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be going over some of the most important papers for paleontology from May 2023. Let's get started. The Burgess Shale isn't the only Lagerstätte with really great fossils coming from the Cambrian, and there's another one that was relatively nearby that actually has some pretty similar fossils, that new one being the Spence Shale, which a new paper just described a lot of the different arthropods that have been found in that shale. Now, there's going to need to be a little bit more specific work about it, but combined with not just the Burgess Shale, but similar shales and Lagerstättes from parts of Utah, like the Wheeler Shale or the Pioche Shale, that really helps to show that there's a large diversity of arthropods in the late Cambrian, and that they are pretty well spread along what would become the western coast of North America. There's also been some growing evidence about the Cambrian, though, specifically that the Cambrian explosion wasn't so much an explosion so much as a more gradual and regularly paced expansion and diversification. So rather than one big burst of diversity, it's a few smaller ones with some constant increases throughout. And this paper essentially just tried to identify if that is the case or if there is still a lot of evidence for the Cambrian explosion. By looking at many fossil occurrences, these researchers were able to show with the statistics that, yeah, the Cambrian explosion really doesn't stand up to at least the evidence we have now. And in fact, even after the Cambrian explosion, the Great Ordovician biodiversification event also probably wasn't as much one single event, but rather a number of smaller events. So this kind of big burst of diversification that we have thought of at the Cambrian and in the Ordovician, it's really much more of a kind of slow, gradual climb than just suddenly, boom, here's all of the different animals. And we can actually see this in action at a new Lagerstätte coming from Wales from the Ordovician. The Castle Bank Lagerstätte is this new Lagerstätte, and it's interesting because it shows some things that aren't as diversified as what we expect from the Cambrian, so things that are related to animals like Opabinia, one of these classic odd Cambrian things. But you also have things like Crinoids, which were around in the Cambrian, but were much larger than the modern ones. Crinoids in the Cambrian were a few inches long, but in the modern day, they're maybe a few millimeters long. And we have found them in the Castle Bank Lagerstätte, and they're really small, kind of like the modern day ones. So you start getting this change in the diversification of those groups into something more like modern faunas, but then you still have weird opabiniids around that I have an entire separate video on that animal, but they're just bizarre. But it's really nice to see that, yeah, no, actually, as we're getting more fossil evidence, it is lining up with some of these other more statistical studies. So it's making a lot of sense that the explosion in the Cambrian and Ordovician for diversity is not quite an explosion. And as we get into some of that diversity, one of the most diverse groups of these were the Crinoids. Especially during the Paleozoic, before the Permian Triassic extinction, there were a lot of different varieties. And now we're looking at some fossils of them coming from the Wooster Shale. Cactocrinus woosterensis, Keichousaurus brushii, Agaricocrinus murphyi, Decadocrinus laevis, and Decadocrinus inornatus are all new species coming from the Wooster Shale. And this is in addition to a few other animals that we already do know from other places, including some of the rocks right around the Wooster Shale. This includes things like different species of Megistocrinus, Cyathocrinides simplex, and Platycrines, as well as some more fragmentary pieces that we can't identify exactly what species of crinoid it is, but it does clearly belong to a group of crinoids that none of those other ones belong to, so it is something different. Interestingly, the Platycrinides specimens from the Wooster Shale are actually better preserved than the same crinoids from other places nearby, which means it might actually be something different. There's a few traits that we don't have preserved in the other ones that have already been named, and if we find a good one of those and it doesn't have those, then yeah, the Wooster Shale probably has something entirely new. And that's also another part of this. The entire rock formations that are around the Wooster Shale are similar oceanic environments, but importantly, they oftentimes have a lot more crinoid diversity, which means that whatever was happening in the oceans when the Wooster Shale was deposited, it wasn't as good for crinoids. They kind of had to shift into or out of certain ranges. This time period in the Carboniferous is known for having a lot of crinoids too, so it's really strange to find that at this point in the inland sea kind of what would become Ohio, that the crinoids weren't doing as well. Whatever was happening, those specialist crinoids just ended up dying out or needing to migrate to other areas. They just couldn't hold it in Ohio. Crinoids suffered a lot during the Permian Triassic mass extinction, which I've already briefly mentioned, but there were also animals on land that didn't do very well. And in fact, predator guilds seem to go over a lot of turnover, and that's based on a new fossil coming from South Africa. Inostrancevia africana is a new species of large gorgonopsid coming from South Africa. But the genus Inostrancevia is really interesting because before this, we only knew of it coming from Russia, which South Africa and Russia are famously not very close together geographically. So what seems like happened is the other gorgonopsids that lived in South Africa mostly died out during one of the bursts of extinction during this mass extinction. And then some of the Inostranceveids actually were able to migrate into South Africa. They then also died out, were replaced by theraspids, and then those also died out during the final pulse of the mass extinction, which is really unfortunate for those organisms, but it helps to show that there were many pulses of extinction that actually occurred during what we think of as one event of the Permian mass extinction. This pattern of extinctions with one major group dying out, a new one moving in, that group dying out, and another one moving in, and then that one dying out, really helps to show how this extinction wasn't just a all-at-once event, like a giant rock hitting the planet. Instead, it was a much longer-term kind of extinction, largely brought on by climate change because of the eruption of the Siberian traps, a series of large volcanoes in Siberia and parts of Russia, where there was a lot of gases released, and that just devastated the environment. So as we're continuing to pollute, we should probably keep that in mind, that it can be bad. On that note, there are other studies on the Permian Triassic extinction, such as looking at some rock cores from China and finding, based on the different isotopes that they had there, that the rainforests largely collapsed. And it seems like they largely collapsed because there were a lot of wildfires happening, which, when we consider what's happened in places like North America, or maybe the South American Brazilian rainforests, or even Australia, we're seeing a lot of wildfires. It's probably something we should also be concerned about. The data also shows that immediately after this period, there wasn't the same isotope being released in even as many numbers as it was before the extinction, which that isotope mostly comes from trees that have died. If all the trees die, there's no new trees dying to help release it. So it seems like it was a pretty rough time for a lot of the ecosystems during this extinction. And as for the animals that did make it through that extinction, there were some different ones, and there's actually an archosaur tooth collection which helps to show this, because it seems like their teeth weren't quite as diverse as we expect later. The archosaurs were a pretty diverse group in the Triassic. There were some herbivorous ones like the etosaurs, and some carnivorous ones like the pseudotsuchians, as well as all of the dinosaurs, which are also archosaurs. So they did pretty well in the Triassic. But this tooth collection from just after the extinction helps to show that the teeth that we have immediately afterwards and immediately beforehand seem pretty similar. It's not like the precursors to the archosaurs suddenly just exploded in diversity. Instead, there was kind of a delay where they were just hunkered down, kind of trying to live their lives as smaller carnivores or smaller herbivores, rather than trying to immediately blow up in size and become the dominant life on the planet. It was a pretty slow recovery. One group of these reptiles that started to become more diverse in the Triassic were the Pachypleurosaurs, which were long-necked, sometimes long-limbed and long-tailed, but probably mostly lived around the water. And some of these come from really great sites, such as Keichousaurus coming from China. In fact, the preservation on one of these was so good that the researchers could map out the entire digestive tract. And it seems like there were some fish that it ate, which goes along with what we expected of these animals. So it really helps to show how even some of these really nice fossils can just help to confirm what some of our biases and suspicions might be. Much later in the reign of the reptiles, in the Cretaceous, you started getting the mosasaurs, which were massive seagoing lizards, actually starting to show up in the fossil record. And one of these is Stelladens mysteriosus. And it's called mysteriosus because it's kind of weird. And Stelladens because Stella is star and dens is tooth. And its teeth had these really weird carinae. These are just little grooves that run on the sides of the teeth. And it had a lot of these and we don't really understand why. It could be interesting to compare it to some of the really early, somewhat more aquatic archosaurs because while they're not archosaurs, they do have some similarities in lifestyle as far as hanging around the water a lot of the time. But it's going to be really hard to try and fully identify what this animal actually used these teeth for. But it seems like they were important because we can tell they're different than any other kind of mosasaurs. The researchers also looked at wear on the teeth, and they didn't find anything that distinctive. They do propose that, hey, maybe the shape helped them process thinner shelled ammonites or crabs, things without super, super hard parts. But also some of the wear on the teeth suggests it wasn't only eating soft food and soft prey, it probably ate pretty hard things sometimes too. Again, it's just really weird teeth and we can't really tell why. Before the mosasaurs became the dominant predators in the oceans though, there were the pliosaurs, short-necked plesiosaurs with pretty large heads. And a new, very fragmentary one was found in England and suggests the upper size limit of them, with it being almost as large as a sperm whale. It's a massive animal, if this size estimate stands. Like I said, a lot of this fossil is pretty partial, and there's been some rumblings already about, hey, we think they did the math wrong on the size of it. It's probably still a very large pliosaur, but closer in size to many of the ones we already know, like Paleopleurodon. So not quite the giant behemoth that it's made out to be in this paper, and it's just going to take a little bit more research to get some more consistent size estimates on some of these pliosaurs. At the same time, there were thalattosuchians, which were entirely marine crocodilian relatives, and at least some of them seem to have developed an adaptation that we actually see in modern-day whales, and that's this groove on the top jaw. And it seems like in whales, the purpose of this groove is to carry blood vessels and help thermoregulation of the skull. It helps make sure the brain and the rest of the body stays at the right temperature. And it's very possible that these thalattosuchians did the same thing with it. It shares very similar morphology, and you can actually track some parts of its evolution, with it just being shallow lines and tubes inside of the bone early on, and then progressively those shallow bones start to become the actual grooves. Now, it's not just blood vessels exposed directly to the ocean water. There would have been some skin over it, but it would have allowed that colder ocean water to get into the body and help regulate the temperature of the animal. Staying in the Jurassic and parts of the early Cretaceous, we're actually going to be jumping onto land in China though, because there's some really, really interesting and famous fossils in the J-hole biota, where there's all these feathered dinosaurs, and sometimes you have some organ material, or sometimes skin preserved in some of them. It's really, really great for understanding the biology of some of these organisms. And it seems like part of the reason that this area had such a broad diversity of different animals is because of how the fossils are preserved, and not just in the fact that they were so well preserved. Because part of the reason they're preserved is because of volcanic ash, but importantly, that volcanic ash also carried a lot of phosphorus into the area. Phosphorus is really, really important for life. It actually builds up parts of DNA, and having extra of it means more animals can actually survive in that area. Phosphorus isn't going to limit as much the kind of diversity in organisms that can stay in the environment. So that same volcanism that probably killed some of those animals and also led to their great preservation is also what allowed them to live. So it's a really interesting look at how the geologic sphere can actually interact with the biosphere. And on the subject of many of those feathers being preserved, there was a paper looking at taphonomy of feathers. And it didn't go and actually look at rocks, it made its own rocks. Essentially, they put feathers inside of some rocks and sediments and pressed them really hard together with pneumatics that were really, really strong. And then applied heat and saw how well the feathers were preserved. And it gives this great kind of continuum of how well they can be preserved. Eventually, some of the melanin that can give some of them color does wear out, but you're still left with the impressions of the feather. So it's a really interesting look at how much of this geology and how feathers get preserved actually happens. And it'll probably be used as a groundwork for future studies using actual fossils in the future. And on the subject of feathers that are preserved in the fossil record, we have something that may or may not be feathers, and those are pycnofibers. Pycnofibers are these little fibrous filaments that cover the bodies of pterosaurs, the flying relatives of dinosaurs that lived during the same time. And there's been some debate as to whether or not they are feathers or if they're related in any way to feathers. And this paper potentially adds some different implications to this, because they looked at the first fossil where these kind of fibers were actually seen, and that's Scaphognathus. And that was as far back as the 1800s. So we've known about them for a while, but Goldfuss, the guy who actually found these pycnofibers, was considered to be crazy because nobody else looked closely enough at the fossil to actually see them. Fortunately now, we have all kinds of fancy lasers and things we can point at fossils, and that's what these researchers did, and they found a few different types of fossils. The first feather type they found is bifurcated. There's also some that are kind of trident-shaped. There's also a type that's similar to the bifurcations, but the side branches actually just point out a little bit more. There's also some that are little tufts, and some that are more feather-like. There were also some blood vessels going through parts of the wing membrane, as well as some of the more structural fibers that would have actually made up the wing, the kinds of collagen and things that would have actually made it possible to fly. And as for the pycnofibers, there are some other pterosaurs that have been found with some complex patterns of different pycnofibers, which means it might be actually more likely than we think that feathers evolved very early in the dinosaur line before even the first dinosaurs, and are actually more likely to have originated with the common ancestors between dinosaurs and the pterosaurs. This means by extension that potentially every dinosaur may have had feathers. Maybe not fully developed complex ones, but at least some kind of fluff around them. Now, they may not have all needed that. For example, you can look at large mammals today, not all of them have a ton of fur, but again, it's something that would have been possible for many of the dinosaurs. And now for more on feathers, we're going to be looking at Sonic Hedgehog. And no, I do not mean the video game character, I mean the gene. Back when researchers were first starting to isolate and identify different genes in different organisms' genomes, this one made some spiky proteins. And they went, spikes, it's kind of like a hedgehog. We'll call it Sonic Hedgehog. Ha ha ha, we're all so funny and clever. And then future research showed that that is an incredibly important gene for just developmental pathways from embryos into actual organisms. The naming rules were changed after this. However, that doesn't mean that it's still not important to study and understand what it does, especially when it was modified in some chicken eggs, and the researchers saw that, hey, instead of just having the kind of scaly bits on chicken legs, we can actually turn those all the way back into feathers, which is really interesting to see. It's starting to help us piece together some parts of the evolution of specific traits in different dinosaurs, especially bird-line dinosaurs. So hopefully there will be a little bit more of this genetic work, and while I don't think we'll be able to perfectly retro-engineer a dinosaur, we might be able to get a little bit closer. Amber in the geologic record has kind of just been considered as coming from random sources, and that's what these researchers tried to find out. Is it just random, or can we tell specific things about it? And they did this by actually processing and looking at some of these pieces of amber under different chemical analyses. And they were able to find, there's definitely different trees that are making these different ambers, these different biologic resins in the fossil record, which is really interesting. Hopefully with that, we'll be able to start piecing together a little bit more about the ecosystems that these various animals were living in, just by looking at the amber and trying to understand where it came from. And as for the trees, there's always going to be animals that ate them, and that includes after the KPG extinction, when the giant rock hit the planet and the non-avian dinosaurs died out. And some mammals became really big very quickly after that, including some of the brontotheres. There's been this general assumption that most animals start out small in their early evolution and then get larger later on. And this paper tried to see if that was categorically true in the brontotheres, some of which were very large, but also some of which were still pretty small. And what they found is that it's not necessarily going to be something that is as specific as they just generally get larger. Instead, it seems like they would have just been occupying different niches, meaning that the really large ones would have been eating different plants than the smaller ones. And so it's just this kind of inherent separation of these different niches that happens. But then the smaller ones are more likely to go extinct because they're more likely to face competition for those smaller plants. For example, if you have a brontothere that's eating all of the really big plants, you need to be that big already to compete with it. But if you're a medium-sized animal competing with a relatively small brontothere, that's a much easier thing to try and compete with. And so potentially some of that competition is what eventually led to the extinction of the smaller brontotheres, but allowed the larger ones to persist for a bit longer. It's not some inherent rule that they just got larger, but it's an inherent system that these animals had to deal with. Staying in mammals, but this time jumping much closer to the modern day within the last few thousand years, there's also the first record of Aniscion dirus coming from South America. Aniscion dirus is the direwolf. And in general, it's been thought to have been mostly limited to North America. There might be one occurrence in parts of China, but overall it seems no, is basically North America. And this really shows that no, they did actually migrate to other places, including some very dry places, like the Atacama Desert in Chile. This is also really interesting because all of the modern dogs that live in South America, like the maned wolf or bush dogs, are actually really closely related, all of them. However, this Aniscion then would be entirely separate from those. So at least once in the lifetime of these organisms, they did get further south, and maybe South America has a little bit more complex of a biologic history than we normally give it credit for. However, that's just because we have incomplete data. Looking at the modern dogs that are there, it makes sense to go, oh yeah, dogs only made it to South America once. They're all really closely related and then they diversified. But no, there were multiple different excursions that the dogs took to get to South America. And in the same way that there's a lot of really unique dogs in South America, Australia just has a lot of really unique animals. And there's this whole new fund that's getting started to try and identify all of the organisms that live in Australia. And this includes fossils, so they have this giant database set up, you can go look at it. It's not anything super official yet, but it's at least getting started some of the kind of very hard groundwork that we want to do in order to understand the biodiversity of certain regions. For example, studying the taxonomy of the ankylosaurs. In general, they've been split into two groups, the ankylosaurs with tail clubs and the coelacanthids, or similar nodosaurs without the tail club, just stiff tails, no club. This paper actually splits them into 4 distinct groups, which is kind of interesting to see. There's the Ankylosauridae, which the ankylosaur-like ones. There's the Panopliosauridae, which are Panpliosaurus-like animals. The Coelacanthidae, which are animals like Polacanthus. And the Struthiosauridae, which is things like Struthiosaurus. Most of these different groups are actually split up by characteristics of the head armor, which is interesting, but since we don't always have the head or the head can be damaged, it also means some of the fossils aren't as usable as we'd like them to be. We need to start reconstructing and trying to figure out where exactly it falls based on other features as well. It's really unfortunate though with these animals because outside of the tail club I mentioned, they're built pretty much the same throughout. Sure, there's some differences like shoulder spikes and whatnot in some of the groups, but overall the armor is built pretty similar, the legs are built pretty similar, they're doing similar things in the environment. It's hard to try and tell a lot of those differences based solely on the head, but that's also seemingly the only part that has major differences. So hopefully we'll get some more research on these animals and try and better understand their evolutionary history. And staying with some Cretaceous fossils, this time we're going to Kyrgyzstan in the Tian Shan Mountains. This is the youngest part of the Himalayas, and it's really interesting because before it became part of the Himalayas, the tallest mountain range on Earth, they were actually a really low-lying area, meaning that there's a lot of rock there that's pretty consistent throughout almost all of geologic time. And that means you can find things like dinosaur fossils there, including these dinosaur footprints that were found in parts of these mountains. It's really interesting to actually see this because they were exposed because of a landslide, and they used photogrammetry, essentially flew a drone over it to take pictures of everything and then put it in through some software and made 3D models of all the prints. And they did that so that they can always have a copy of it because there's probably going to be another landslide. They can't just necessarily haul all the rocks off the side of a cliff face and put them into a nice museum. They need another way to preserve it. And it's really interesting seeing some of this newer technology being used to understand fossils that are otherwise in danger of being eroded or just collapsing into dust. There's also a dinosaur that was known first from footprints, and that's Vespersaurus. And the reason I say this is because there was footprints that showed a dinosaur running on one toe. And then we found Vespersaurus and hey, it would have had these 2 toes lifted up while it ran. It's really interesting, and this paper looked at this animal in a little bit more detail. These researchers were actually trying to understand how it would have used its toes and to see if its toes that were lifted up had any kind of clawing ability. And so they measured out the toes and put it to different stress tests in a model, and it doesn't seem like the toes were super specialized, which actually tracks with what we kind of expect of Vespersaurus. Vespersaurus wasn't particularly massive. It was probably somewhat a generalist, catching whatever smaller prey it could and managing to survive. And because its toes weren't specially adapted for something like piercing and holding prey or running really fast like cheetah claws are, it does really make it seem like, yeah, it was just trying to live a very middle-of-the-road life. That's what the species had evolved for, and it did relatively well. It was around later in the Cretaceous, so they made it for some good time. Just when a giant rock hit the planet, they didn't make it anymore. Staying with South American fossils, we're going to be going to the Brazilian Romulado Formation, where there's been a lot of pterosaurs found, but a lot of them have been collected by private collectors that are trying to sell them off or smuggle them out of the country. Now, though, there's actual research happening by institutions in Brazil that are able to collect the fossils and also tell us where exactly they are in the different layers of the formation. And it seems like there's one main layer that actually has a lot of these fossils, including these pterosaur fossils, which are mostly known from other species and specimens, but it's good to know specifically where these ones came from. so we can start piecing together the entire history of the lake that deposited these different rocks. It's also really helpful because it shows how, hey, if these fossils stay in Brazil, where Brazilian researchers who are familiar with the rocks they come from can work on them, we can actually make some real progress on the science instead of just selling off fossils to whoever. Staying in the Cretaceous, but jumping all the way to southern England, we're going to be looking at some Spinosaurid fossils, and specifically a Spinosaurid tooth that comes from southern England. And that's because it doesn't match any of the other known Spinosaurs from the Wealden group, where most of the Spinosaurids from the UK have been found. Now, like I said, it's just some teeth. We really can't tell a lot from this organism other than it doesn't match those other Spinosaurids, which means that whatever was happening with the diversity of Spinosaurs in England, it was pretty big. There's a lot of diversity that we already know of coming from there, with many different species. And there's also another new Spinosaur coming from Spain that helps to show this too. Prodathletis cinquetorrensis was named after the town of Cinco Torres, which is near where it was found. The other part of the name, Prodathletis, actually comes from the Greek for champion, to celebrate the football club Villarreal's success in Europe a few seasons earlier, where they won one of the European Cups. So, go them. That team's also very well known for wearing bright yellow, which is why in the art for Prodathletis, you see it in yellow a lot of the time. It matches the club. Unfortunately, it's very incomplete, like most Spinosaurids are, but there's enough features to show that, yeah, it is distinct. There's also another one from nearby named Viabonavenatrix, which is interesting because, like I already mentioned in England, there's a lot of diversity there. Plus, we have the diversity here. Plus, we have even more diversity throughout other parts of Spain that aren't as localized around the towns of Villarreal and Cinco Torres. What all of this means mostly is just that there's a lot of diversity in Spinosaurs and Baryonychines, especially in Europe. The Spinosaurs overall did get more diverse outside of Europe, with things like Spinosaurus, the multiple species from South America, as well as some species from Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, outside of Europe, the Baryonychines, you get Suchomimus, and that's basically it. There's one isolated fossil of a Baryonychine tooth from South America, but overall they're even worse preserved than most other Spinosaurs. So it's really interesting to see how at least the Baryonychines did really well in Europe, but it took the Spinosaurids to really take the group a little bit more globally and migrate into much more distant parts of the world. And that brings us to a paper we did an entire separate video on, and that is on Irritator, where it's another Spinosaurid. They looked at the various different pieces of it, and we're able to say, hey, its mouth opens kind of funny. And it's not a snake out wide here, it's out wide in the back. So if it opens, it goes, whoop. That way it can swallow larger prey down that gap at the back of its jaws. So really would have been really helpful for helping these animals actually eat more efficiently, which means they can spend more time hunting or more time not getting their prey stolen by larger dinosaurs. So it seems like it was a really useful adaptation for them, as it seems like the Spinosaurids, for at least their size, were eating relatively medium-sized prey as opposed to taking on much larger prey. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. Really appreciate the support on these kinds of videos, because these videos take a lot of effort and time and editing and writing and making sure I have everything that I want in. Signing up for the Patreon really does help. Helps, keep the lights on so we can try and keep filming these, because like I said, they take a good amount of effort to make sure we got everything in. And we really do appreciate that support. With that in mind, be sure to check out the links below where you can help support the channel in other ways as well. And be safe. Take care. Don't go extinct.